Verdansk has been destroyed, and Warzone Season 3 is here. So, it's time to get ahead of the competition and make sure that your in-game settings are set up so that you get the best FPS, the best visibility, and the lowest input latency possible. Hey guys, it's Warzone Dave here. Welcome back to another Warzone Season 3 video. Today, we are going to be talking through the best settings to improve your FPS and visibility in Warzone to give you that competitive edge over everyone else in the lobby. I've done a couple of these videos on different games as well as Warzone previously. I think the last time I did one specifically for Warzone on settings was back in Season 2 of the first kind of chapter, so quite a while back now. And there's been new settings added to the game over time. I didn't want to do one every single season, but I think now's about time that I come back to this topic and bring you guys an update to that video that tells you exactly what settings you should be running that will allow you to, as I said, improve your FPS, improve that visibility, and keep that latency low. It's a balancing act. It's not just chuck everything on low, because that does give you FPS, but it also makes the game kind of look terrible and you actually can't spot enemies, and it doesn't actually help you. So the settings today are going to be everything to cover everything we need. Now, if you do enjoy today's video, please do make sure that if you haven't already, subscribe down below and click the notification bell to be notified every time I upload new videos here on the channel. Also follow me on Twitter, where we get discussions going on everything in regards to gaming, Warzone, and kind of whatever I'm feeling like on the day. So yeah, go follow me over there as well. So before we even jump into the game and the settings within there, there's actually some stuff we need to check beforehand. So first thing that you need to do is make sure that your graphics driver is up to date. Now I know this sounds like a very, very general bit of advice, but actually before this update, at least on the Nvidia side of things, the best driver for keeping your FPS high and making sure that your 1% lows weren't dipping too low, so basically you weren't getting that kind of stuttering where your FPS drops really randomly here and there. It was actually an older driver. But this new driver's come out, and it's been tested on for Season 3, and people are saying that this is the best driver to run now. So it's simple as make sure that you have your drivers up to date. If you're someone who likes to run older drivers, ignore that now, get this up to date, because there's a lot of new stuff in Warzone for Season 3, which these new drivers help out with. So if you're on Nvidia, you can just come into your drivers and make sure you're updated to the latest one. At the time of filming, it is 466.11. If you're on an AMD card, I'm assuming it's a similar thing. I can't exactly confirm for that, but make sure you got your drivers up to date. Secondly, and before we jump into the game, if you have an Nvidia card, this is going to be an Nvidia tip specifically for you guys. Jump into your Nvidia control panel, and I want you to come to the Manage 3D Settings area, go to Program Settings, select Modern Warfare, which is of course Warzone, and then make sure that your image sharpening is turned on, and I set mine to 0.65 with Ignore Film Grain set to 0. Now, I watched a video on this recently, and this is a setting which I used to use for a lot of different games. I also, more recently, have used NVIDIA filters, which is what a lot of people have used to help alleviate problems with just general visibility in Warzone, as well as the rose skin. In general, Warzone is a bit muddy, it's kind of blurry overall, the textures aren't very sharp, things don't just appear sharp on your screen, and so the NVIDIA filters were used by many people to get away around that. Now, NVIDIA filters, they take up a lot of FPS in your system. And so I turned them off recently and switched to a different way of kind of tackling the same problem, which is to use this image sharpening setting. So, come in here, turn the image sharpening on, you'll apply down in this corner down here. Following that, go to your Adjust Desktop Color Settings, select the correct monitor, and then you're going to turn up the digital vibrance. So it will be at 50%. Turn it up to around between 60 and 70. It's kind of personal preference. And what this will do is it will push the colors. Now, you can't do this from the NVIDIA control panel on a game-by-game basis. There is an external application that allows you to do this. But in terms of just covering all games, which I think you should do this for anyway, turning this digital vibrance up just brings those colors out, and combining that with the sharpening that I just told you about, it does a very similar thing to what the NVIDIA filters would do, but with, I think, basically no FPS loss in comparison to the NVIDIA filters, which definitely take away up to 20 FPS, where you might not have that spare to just give away. So turn these two things on before you even start doing anything in the game, and you're instantly going to have a better looking game. Okay, so now we're in game and we're going to go through these settings as quick as possible, but I'm going to be breaking down each setting and trying to explain to you why I have it set as I do. Now, before we even go to the graphics settings, there is actually a pretty important setting in general that does affect FPS, and that is FOV. So if you're on a lower end system, then you might not want to have your FOV turned all the way up. The reasoning for this is because the larger FOV you have, technically the more that you have rendered on your screen at one time. Obviously, if I have my FOV set to 60, which you'd never want, then you're only seeing a very small amount. You can see it from the image here. You're only seeing a small amount of the screen, and a lot of this other stuff doesn't actually get rendered. So if you're finding yourself really needing to grab a couple of FPS more here and there, then potentially if you're running at 128 field of view, you could turn it to 110 or potentially 100. Now, this might affect your gameplay a little bit, so it's a bit of a balancing act. I can run this at 120 no issue because I've got a strong PC, but this is somewhere that if you start having struggles, you can adjust this and get that improved little bit of FPS. Just a little tip before we jump into the graphics. So, moving on to the graphics, first thing is our display mode. And we have the options of windowed, full screen borderless, and full screen extended window. Most of the time, you'll see people either use full screen or full screen borderless. If you want pure high FPS and low input latency, go for full screen. This will give the game an exclusive full screen to run in, and it won't have anything else trying to be rendered in the background on your desktop, and you will get better FPS overall. Some people will get away with running full screen borderless and they won't have any problems in terms of FPS, and having it in full screen borderless will mean you'll be able to alt tab in and out of the game a bit easier, and that to some people might be really important, to some people it might not matter at all. So if that's something that really matters to you, you find yourself alt tabbing a lot, maybe run full screen borderless, but just you are taking a risk, you might lose a bit of FPS. Try both these out. If there's any kind of shadow of a doubt of maybe full screen borderless is taking away some of that pure performance feeling, then just go to full screen, stick with it, deal with the alt tab issues, and you'll have a better time overall. Display adapter, obviously, it's going to be set to your graphics card. If you've got multiple graphics cards, then good for you, but just make sure it's got the correct thing set here. I don't know if there's a scenario where you might have more things set here, like an internal GPU or something. You don't want anything like that set, so make sure you've got your graphics card selected here. Screen refresh rate, make sure this is set to whatever the refresh rate of your monitor is. I've got a 240Hz monitor, so I set mine to 240. A lot of you guys might have 144, or you might still, unfortunately, be sitting on 60Hz monitors. And that's the point. If you're able to upgrade from a 60 to 144Hz, do it. It's going to completely revolutionize how you play. I was about to say FPSs, but literally any game on your PC. But I've got 240, so I select 240 here. Render resolution, there's never really a good reason to change this off of 100. What this basically does is, if I've got this set to 1920 by 1080 and I turn this down to, I think, like 66 is the lowest, I start getting towards kind of that 1280 by 720, so a 720p image. This is not a good way of doing this. I do actually recommend, if you have some FPS issues, that you turn your resolution down. That's a genuinely good way of maintaining decent FPS if you're not able to get it from anywhere else. But render resolution is not the way to do it. You want to change your display resolution down. So I would change it down to 1280 by 720, and then keep this at 100. That's really the aim here. Ideally, you're in a situation where you just run at your native resolution. I've got a 1080p monitor. I stick it at 100, and that way I'm just rendering out at the exact resolution that my monitor is. That's the ideal. If you need a bit more FPS later down the line, turn down your display resolution. Don't touch the render resolution. Aspect ratio, automatic is fine. Sync every frame. You do not want this on. This is VSync. It's not nice. If you're someone who wants to use G-Sync, this isn't the video for it. Go check out somewhere else how you can set up G-Sync if you're someone who likes using it. I don't like using it for kind of competitive style games, so I keep this disabled. Custom frame rate limit, I've got this set to custom, although I think I want to actually set to unlimited. Yeah, I would have to set to unlimited. I don't want to limit my FPS in games. There's very few games out there where you actually want to limit your FPS, unless it's something like Counter-Strike, where you can reach those crazy, like, thousands of FPS levels. At that point, maybe you limit it because you might actually get like a pure experience in terms of your input latency. But for a game like this, where you're not even going to be hitting like crazy high FPS, unlimited is simply going to be the best option for you. There's a little argument potentially to put it on custom and then come down here and have your gameplay custom frame rate limit, your menu custom frame rate limit set lower, so that when you're in the menu, it's a bit of a lower frame rate, not taking up much resources in your system. But in general, stick it on unlimited, you're going to have a better time. NVIDIA highlights. If you like using NVIDIA highlights, then you can keep this on, but this will affect performance, so I would recommend turning this off. NVIDIA Reflex Low Latency. Turn this to Enabled plus Boost. It will give you better latency overall in games. This has been tested. There is actually a setting for this back in the NVIDIA control panel we looked at earlier. Make sure it's disabled in there. You don't want it enabled in there, the low latency mode. To keep that disabled, put it on Enabled plus Boost in whatever game you are running with. In our example, in Warzone, we have it Enabled plus Boost. Display gamma, keep it to 2.2. For a monitor, if you're on a TV, you can change it to the other one. Simple as that. Details and textures. Streaming quality, keep this on low. As you can see, favors textures performance over quality. In general, this affects this on-demand texture streaming option down here, which I've disabled anyway, so changing this setting doesn't do much, if anything. It's hard to tell. But I keep this on low because, as the tooltip on the right says, this value is recommended if you have less RAM or if you just want to favor performance over quality. Texture resolution, I put this on normal. If you want to get pure FPS, like if you're running on a really low-end system and you want to get pure FPS, shove this on very low. You're going to use less VRAM overall in the game. But, in my opinion, turning this to normal makes the game look so much better, and assuming you have a decent enough GPU, and I'm not talking about, a 30 series, assuming you have a modern GPU, this setting won't affect your FPS that much, because it's more down to your VRAM than like the individual things that these other settings do. So keep it on normal, drop it down if you really need the extra gains, but your game will look considerably more horrible and visibility will drop tremendously. Texture filter and isotropic, got this set to high. A lot of people would look at this setting and just go, oh, this is something which is just going to take up FPS, I'll put this on low. But this barely affects your FPS. I'm talking 1 or 2 FPS. And it, once again, improves visibility, specifically when you're looking at textures from an angle. So like in the image here, if we're looking at this floor from an angle, so we're not looking directly down at it, it makes the actual textures a bit easier to distinguish between. And this is going to be important when there's people at those oblique angles against textures in the background. It will allow people to stand out a bit better, and you'll get overall improved visibility. Particle quality. This is a very interesting one. I found out recently that apparently, if you have this set to low, you will get better FPS if you're right in front of something with a high amount of particles. So like fires, smoke, which doesn't happen too often. But if you set it to high, you actually get higher FPS when you're just in those open areas than you do when you have it on low. So that's why you'll see a lot of people running with particle quality on high. It's not because they want really good quality particles. It's because it actually improves your FPS for some reason. No one seems to understand why, but just put it on high because it gives you better FPS. Bullet impacts and sprays. I've got this set to enabled. Doesn't really affect FPS, so it's just a nice setting to have on to understand spray patterns and such. It will just help you with your game in general, I find. Tessellation, this is another one very similar to the texture filter and isotropic. It barely affects your FPS going from disabled to all. So just put it on because it improves how the game looks. It improves the visibility. On-demand texture streaming, I've got this set to disabled. Shadow map resolution, I've got set to low. This does make the shadows look pretty horrible, but shadows are never something I really care about unless I'm playing like a single player game for that kind of realism of how the shadows look. In Warzone, I don't really care how shadows look, and shadows are infamously an FPS hungry beast. Shadows will just eat up your FPS, so put this to low to get the best FPS, basically whatever system you're on. If you're someone who really hates the low shadows, like you just can't bear looking at them, then go to normal, but don't go above at all. There's never a reason to go above normal. There's very little difference in visual fidelity above normal when you go to things like high and extra. So normal if you can't stand the low shadows, low if you want the best FPS. Cache spot shadows and cache sun shadows is basically that certain shadows in the game are stored in the cache. So they're stored as like basically locally in your RAM. So it causes the game to use additional RAM. if you have, I believe, you know, if you've got over 8 gigs of RAM, or I'd say if you have 8 gigs of RAM, I've got 16 gigs, then 100% have the setting on. As you can see, it stores them in the cache to speed up rendering for future frames. So it's basically storing that data rather than the game having to reproduce them every time you look at certain shadows. And this improves your FPS overall if you have the RAM to support it. So if you've got 8 gig, potentially, I guess 16 gig is probably a better bet. Put this on. But in general, just try out both. Try out disabled, try it enabled for a couple of games, see what works better for you. Do your own benchmarking. It can be really helpful as well as these tutorials to do some of the testing yourself as well. Particle lighting, low. There's very little difference when you turn this up and down. It has a small effect on FPS. It has like no effect on visual fidelity, so it's just a simple one to just chuck on low because it doesn't really do anything. DirectX ray tracing is 100% a no-no. This is something which only RTX cards like mine can do. If you have an RTX card, do not have ray tracing on. You'll eat like 50 FPS. And it's more of a thing for like that single player side of Modern Warfare if you're playing that, or just other single player games which have ray tracing. Ambient Occlusion, disabled. Not something that we need. It adds soft shadows intersecting with each other's, creating depth. So it's basically how different shadows overlap and interact with each other, and you end up with these kind of, as you can see from the image here, you get these interesting kind of fading shadows off a small object and stuff. It doesn't really add to visual fidelity, and it definitely uses up FPS, so keep it disabled. Screen space reflection is quality of reflections. Reflections are never a useful thing. You're not looking in a reflection and see an enemy behind you. That never happens, so disabled. Finally, onto this last section. Filmic Strength, set it to 0. Hey guys, Dave from the future here. Just a quick edit to what I was about to say here. You actually want to have the Filmic Strength set to 1, so the bar all the way to the right, assuming that you're not using one of those high anti-aliasing values, so SMAA T2X or Filmic SMAA T2X. If you're not using either of those, so you're using the off or the SMAA 1X, like I'm using, then you want to have Filmic Strength on 1 to reduce the visual noise. Okay, back to the video. NVIDIA DLSS, a new option that's just come in. I would recommend start with this disabled. If you want to do some testing with it and you have a GeForce RTX card that can support it, try this out. It might work for you. What DLSS does is basically, if you're running at a high resolution, something like 2K or above, so 2K, 4K, 8K if you're a madman and playing Warzone at 8K, what you'll actually do is by running a DLSS option, you will downscale it. So, for example, if I was playing at 2K, I could play the game at 1080p, and then it uses super sampling to upscale that back to 2K. And what it should end up with is 1080p resolution FPS values, so higher FPS values, but the image should look something like 2K. It won't look exactly like 2K, but it will look better than 1080p on a 2K screen. Hopefully that's conveyed across to you. I know it's a hard thing to explain if you don't know what DLSS is, but in general, just follow the guidelines on the right if you're playing at 2K and above, and see if DLSS might be a saving grace for you in Warzone. Anti-aliasing, I've got this set to SMAA 1X. This is an interesting one because a lot of people will just say, put anti-aliasing on off, but I hate the jagged lines in video games. I absolutely hate them. I cannot stand them, so I put SMAA 1X on because it just softens things up a bit, and then because I've got that sharpen filter on outside of the game, it actually leads to a nice image. It's not blurry, it's a sharp, non-jagged image, so it's a mixture of anti-aliasing with a sharpening filter, creates a really good looking game. Depth of field, world motion blur, weapon motion blur, film grain, and dynamic resolution. Turn all that off. It's not something that we want to use. Dynamic resolution is something that you could potentially use as a different option to DLSS if you don't have the RTX card. But in general, don't touch it. Try and get your FPS from elsewhere before you even start looking into an option like this. And that's it, guys. That is all the options in the graphics settings for Warzone in Season 3. I know that was a fairly long video, but I wanted to cover every setting in depth so that you guys know what to expect going in. If you try out these settings and you get better FPS results, comment down below, tell me what you started at in terms of FPS and tell me what you're on. Oh, as I hit my mic, tell me what you're on now. I want to see how well this has worked out for all you guys, and hopefully it has helped you guys out a bunch. If it has, make sure, as I said at the beginning, subscribe down below, like the video, and comment below with your results. Thanks very much, guys. I'll catch you guys in my next video. Bye-bye.